It was 10:30 at night. I was riding shotgun in my friend Aman's car, along with three other friends, two guys and one girl, who were seated behind. We had gone to a resort in the outskirts of town to have dinner, and we were returning home by the highway. It was a dark, deserted road with no street lights. Inside the car, the three friends in the back seat were constantly joking about how creepy the road was, and how all of them had heard stories of some ghostly children who kept crossing the street, running barefoot. I was enthralled by their tales, but didn't quite believe them, for they were too over the top to be true. Armando was quaking in his seat, begging them to stop. I laughed and patted him on the back, ensuring him that they were only joking and there were no such things as ghosts or evil spirits. Just then, three middle-aged men suddenly appeared, walking on the side of the road. For the split second that I saw them, their features were imprinted in my mind. The one on the left was dressed in a maroon cardigan. The one in the center had a yellow turban on his head, and the one on the right had a black shawl wrapped around his shoulder. Their appearance was so sudden that a man swerved the car violently to avoid hitting them, causing us all to jump in our seats. We barely crossed them. The shock inside the car was tankable. The laughter of seconds ago was reduced to stunned silence. It was too dark to make out where these three men came from, but if you were me, you would have sworn they appeared out of thin air. I was in the front seat, constantly keeping my eye on the road. I would have seen beforehand if three men in such distinct clothes were walking on the side of the road. There was no banter now, no more ghost stories. We were too petrified to even make conversation. The girl in the back urged our man to drive faster, so we could reach home sooner. I think all of us were uncomfortable at this point. My own heart was thumping hard, but I put on a brave visage and turned back to convince them that everything was fine, and that those men were probably locals from the nearby village out on a post-dinner walk. Just then, our car swerved violently again, skidding dangerously close to the divider. I turned around with my head on Aman's shoulder to steady myself and yelled what the hell was that. I looked at Aman. His fists were gripping the steering wheel tight. His voice came out in barely a whimper. He said he saw three men walking, the same three men we crossed 5 minutes back. I looked at him in disbelief, trying to reason that it couldn't be possible. I asked if the man in the center was wearing a yellow headgear. Aman confirmed it and mentioned how one of the men had a maroon jacket on. He swore they were the same men. An irrational fear tightened itself around my heart in a vice-like grip. Finding my voice, I looked at the navigation app on my phone. I then realized we had around 1 kilometer off this road ahead of us. The highway was filled with potholes, but Aman drove as fast as he could and crossed the distance within 10 minutes. On the last stretch of the highway, just before the familiar lights of the town came into view, we could spot a single headlight in the distance. I grabbed Aman's wrist in caution, as everyone else held their breath, not knowing what to expect. And as we drove closer, we could see a broken down motorbike by the road. Three men stood next to it, waving at us, asking us to stop our car and get help. These men were much younger, probably in their 20s, but the one who flagged us down was wearing a maroon cardigan, and the one standing closest to the motorbike had a black shawl thrown carelessly around his shoulders. We didn't stop. None of us uttered a word. Aman stepped on the accelerator and sped past in a whiz. I looked back, terrified that these men might follow us on their bike, but all I saw was the darkness. The headlight that had been flashing just a few seconds ago had disappeared. Where had it gone? Neither Aman, nor I, nor the three friends in the back seat said a word until we reached the familiar entrance into the city. It was then that all of us let out a huge sigh of relief. What was it that just happened? Who were those three men, and what were they trying to tell us? What would have happened had we stopped our car? I still get goosebumps when I think about that fateful night, and the chills that run down my spine every time the image of those three men flashes in my mind are the only evidence remaining now. Evidence that whatever happened that night was real, and not just a figment of my imagination. I was driving from Atlanta, Georgia to Lexington, South Carolina, along with my girlfriend to visit my parents. I enjoy driving at night since there are less people on the road, which of course equals to less drama. At around 3 a.m., I stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us before we were on our way. We were now due in about an hour. By this time, my girlfriend had been sleeping while I listened to some radio to distract myself from the long road that was yet to be traveled. I started getting a little drowsy, so I decided to take a sip of my coffee. There were no cars in sight, except for the few that I spotted on the side of the road, here and there. In the distance, I made out what looked like a hitchhiker, but I couldn't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer, I start to notice other things, like how the person was kind of thin and tall, and for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet, it turns around and locks eyes with me. It was now clear to me that this was no person, but the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my life. At first, I assumed it could be a deer. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, I watched this thing walk for about 30 seconds on first glance, to passing it. The posture it had was human, standard by its stance, arms back and chin down. But the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost black hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it, I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake my girlfriend up to keep me calm enough to get to the next exit, where a large gas station is situated just a couple of miles away. Like hell, I was going to offer him close to that thing. After we pulled into the gas station, I had a complete meltdown. I couldn't talk, breathe, or anything, but want to curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. I don't think she believed me though, but she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon, I dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat. She would tease me about it or just roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. While driving from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo in Mexico back in the 80s, we had two ways to get to Ciudad Hidalgo, which was the National Road, or the old National Road, which was called Mil Cumbres. Mil Cumbres basically means 1,000 curves that stretched off the road. It literally had 1,000 curves, so a lot of people would get motion sickness when using the road. One evening on our way back to my grandparents, who lived in Ciudad Hidalgo, my grandfather was driving, and he loved taking Mil Cumbres because it had really nice views, and he just really loved driving that road. But since we had the new National Road, not a lot of people used that road anymore, so it was kind of desolate, with the exception of passing one or two little towns. It was dusk so soon, that meant that being on such a desolate road in the mountains, we would be in complete darkness on the road, with no many other cars on the same stretch of road. It took 2 hours to get to the town on the road, so maybe 45 minutes into the drive, it had already gotten really dark, and as we were driving, my grandfather started slowing down. I was sitting in the back seat, because my grandmother was in the front with my grandfather, so I kind of stood over the front chairs to see why he was slowing down. That's when I saw a huge tree log blocking the road. My grandfather came to a stop, and immediately started going in reverse to turn around and get out of there immediately. After we turned, my grandfather stepped on the gas pedal, and I was sort of thrown back into the back seat. I immediately turned around to see if I could see anything as we sped away. I could see men, very dimly, since the light from the taillights from the car was starting to get dimmer and dimmer, coming from out of the adjacent trees next to the tree log on the road with flashlights and guns. Needless to say, my grandfather has never used that road ever again, and I still wonder what those men were planning to do to us that night. I thank God that we didn't find out though.